Welcome, everybody, to the Love You Wealth podcast. I am Cesar Miran, the founder of Cultivating Wisdom and Microdosing Over 50. What a pleasure to have you here. If you're joining us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, welcome. And welcome, Gary Seelhorst, my co-host. How are you?
I'm doing well, Cesar. I'm doing great. It's great to be here. Again, my name's Gary Seelhorst. I'm a former pharmaceutical executive, now an executive wellness coach and psychedelic drug researcher. A little bit about the podcast. So it's really our attempt to redefine wealth, not necessarily in terms of money, but more in terms of health, mindfulness, connection. It's largely geared towards fathers, really to examine their legacy and looking at what the rest of their life is going to look like. And hopefully we can steer it in the right direction. So one of the things I wanted to be clear about is that this is a warts and all kind of podcast. We're going to be going through a lot of our trials and tribulations, how we've messed up as fathers, what's worked well since then. Nobody is a perfect parent. If anyone tells you they are a liar, or they're selling you something. So one of the recurring themes that we'll have on this podcast is going to be health and wellness, not only in the Western medicine paradigm, but also in terms of alternative medicine, which is now becoming more and more accepted and part of the mainstream. And it's largely because of the life's work of our very, very special guest today, Rick Doblin, who heads up MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I met Rick a couple of years ago at the MAPS conference out in Colorado. And Cesar, I know that you've gotten to know Rick over the last couple of years. Is that right?
I have. I've been incredibly lucky to be in Rick's presence. I met Rick back in February 2023 at Psychedelics in Miami. And just right off the bat, what an impression Rick left, just his humanity, his heart, the way he is. So we're incredibly honored. We're incredibly humbled to have you as our first guest, Rick, which is amazing for us to have you. So welcome to the podcast, Rick.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and it's been great to get to know you as well. And that was quite an event that we had there in Miami, and we've continued it in other ways and many more in the future.
Yeah, Rick. Well, obviously, this podcast is about fathers, about being the best parent we can, and about healing. And healing isn't something that's individual. Healing is something that comes through community. Healing is something that comes through family. I wanted to know, you, someone who's worked hand in hand with psychedelics, how have psychedelics helped you to connect more with your family, helped you to be a more present dad?
Well, let me give a broader definition of psychedelic. So psychedelic meaning mind manifesting, that's the original nature of the world. So for me, I include cannabis as a psychedelic in that it brings things to the surface. So starting with that, I'll say that one of my absolute favorite parts of parenthood was smoking marijuana and reading bedtime stories. It was absolutely one of the best things that we did as parents, my wife and I. And, as a parent, you end up, particularly when your kids are little, you got to read the same story like 30 times over. By the time you read it twice, it's getting a little bit, simple and boring. But when you're high, it's a whole different thing. And so there's actually something called dialogic reading, which is this idea about how when you're reading to your kids, you don't just read to them. At some point, you ask for dialogue. You say, "What do you think about this? So I would be high and I'd say, "Look at this bird up in the tree," just as part of the illustration. What do you think that bird is thinking? And so it was just my kids then started to associate the smell of marijuana with bedtime stories. And one of the things that I had as a young man, when I was growing up, I read the Tolkien trilogies and thought they were just fantastic. And I came up with this idea that I would love to read them out loud, all three of them, to my children. And we ended up doing that. It took years, and it was really funny because, we have 3 kids in 4 years. The oldest is a boy, Eden, and he would end up hearing the entire chapter. The middle daughter, a year and a half younger, Alila, she would fall asleep usually like in the middle of the chapter. And our youngest, Ellie, was 4 years younger than Eden. She would fall asleep after the first page or so. So we were, though, able to read the entire Tolkien trilogy. So I think that was just one of the ways. The other ways that you you learn about psychedelics when you do them about how your own parents really educated you. And then you think and reflect on that. And is that something that I want to repeat in my children? And I was just really blessed and lucky to have incredible parents. My dad had this quote above his desk, and then each of us, he made it for each of his, I'm one of 4 kids. We have this poster, and it said something like this. It was a guy, Nisim Ezekiel, and it was like, "Forgive me for my secret wish to make my children over in my own image. Let them dance to their own tune, however dissonant it might be to my own." So it was this whole beautiful thing about wanting to help your kids become themselves rather than become, a mini version of them, or to fulfill the things that they didn't fulfill, and now you had to do that. So my grandfather was very poor, came over from Poland in 1920, and running from anti-Semitism, came penniless, and met my grandmother, who'd also come from Poland, and they were very poor. They had a bookstore, and my dad was the only child. And by the time that he was 4, he knew he had to be a doctor. That was, the Jewish approach out of poverty. He had to be a doctor, which he enjoyed, but he decided that he would raise his kids a different way and help us do whatever we wanted to do. And so when I kind of was the first one off to college, and started doing LSD in my freshman year of college, and realizing that I was emotionally unbalanced, spiritually unbalanced, intellectually ahead of myself, but not in balance. The world was like that. And I called up my parents in the middle of my freshman year and said, "I want to drop out of college. I want to study LSD, and I want you all to pay for it." And
how'd that come? How'd that go over?
Well, it took a couple of months, but this is back in the day before cell phones, and I would just call, and we'd have a phone call like once a week or something. My younger brother saw the pain and the suffering and the frustration that it caused my parents. And it felt like we got 2 different messages. The message I got is, in the end, they said they would support me to do that. And what they said was that they were convinced it was a mistake, but that if I didn't get their help, it would take me longer to realize it was a mistake. And then once I realized it was a mistake, I wouldn't want to admit it, because then my parents would have been right. So they said, "We're going to help you, but it's because we believe it's a mistake, and you'll realize it sooner." But then they said, "There's a tiny bit of doubt, maybe you know what you need to do." That was absolutely incredible. That was so affirming to me. So that's how the main lessons that I got from my parents is how I tried to raise our kids, was just to try to support them in whatever directions they want to emerge. And, it might be different than what I had in mind for them, but that I should give them the same benefits that I got from my own parents. The other part of this was that because I did all this, smoking marijuana to read bedtime stories, and we didn't want to hide anything about my work with psychedelics. So we reached this really important turning point when they each turned 13, and they had their bar bat mitzvahs. And, I remember being extraordinarily disappointed by the outcome of my own bar mitzvah. Now, again, I mentioned I'm the oldest of 4 kids, so I didn't have any older siblings to tell me stuff, but I really thought that this rite of passage was going to transform me, and that I would have some spiritual insight, and I would be catapulted into this kind of more adult life. And it just was just this incredible feeling of emptiness, realizing that I was the same. This rite of passage didn't really engage me with any kind of spiritual anything. It was a good party. I learned Hebrew, but it just didn't have that spiritual sense. So when each of our 3 kids turned 13, my wife and I felt that that's an age where many indigenous cultures will have rites of passage experiences with psychedelics with their kids. So we offered them, we said, if you want marijuana or MDMA, we think you're old enough, and come and we'll give it to you, and we can do it together, and you can see what it's like. So this was a real big part of, I think, how psychedelics influenced because when I started taking LSD when I was 17 and 18, I thought this is what my bar mitzvah should have been.
Yeah.
Who am I? Where do I fit in? What's, and it takes courage to let go. It was just engaging me. It was really difficult. So What we didn't anticipate is that offering our kids MDMA or marijuana would be the best possible anti-drug strategy we could have thought of. They all said, "We're not ready. Don't give it to us." It was amazing.
But I think that's important, right? It's important that relationship that we have with our children, right? That we're open, we're honest with them, right? We don't hide stuff from them, especially when we're teaching them, hey, harm reduction, we're teaching them safety, we're teaching them responsibility. I think that's incredibly important as a parent to do that, especially, Rick, you talked about it, psychedelics, mind manifesting, mind expanding, what an experience, what a wonderful experience at that age when it's in that condition, when it's in that structure.
Yeah, and actually what we started teaching them about at a very early age was the difference between what's moral and what's legal. And that there's not the same. You cannot assume that what's legal is what's moral. And therefore, there are certain laws that are counterproductive, that are prejudicial, different ways. So we actually started training our kids from a very early on, several years old even on. It's just that you have to have your own sense of morality, and it may conflict. And we started teaching them about nonviolent civil disobedience. Now here's something that many people don't know, but I found incredibly interesting. It relates to nonviolent civil disobedience and psychedelics. So the first research that I ever did was a long-term follow-up, a 25-year follow-up to the Good Friday experiment. The Good Friday experiment was Timothy Leary with Walter Pahnke in 1962, trying to see if psychedelics could catalyze a mystical experience. And this was done with Reverend Howard Thurman, this incredible African-American minister at Marsh Chapel from Boston University in 1962 on Good Friday. And 20 people went into the services. They were from Andover and Newton Theological Seminary, and they all got a pill. Half had psilocybin, half had placebo. And the experiment demonstrated that 9 out of the 20 had enough of a score to consider a mystical experience, and 8 out of those 9 had the psilocybin. So I did this 25-year follow-up, and what I learned was amazing, was that Howard Thurman, this incredible minister, had actually studied with Gandhi, and he'd been in India with Gandhi, and he had really learned about nonviolent resistance. And later on, Martin Luther King came to Boston University to get his PhD, and Howard Thurman was his mentor. So Howard Thurman is this link between Gandhi and nonviolence in the US civil rights movement. And what Howard Thurman was really interested in, and why he permitted this experiment to be conducted, was he was interested in the political implications of the mystical experience. And if you feel connected to everything, it's harder to be prejudiced. It's harder to be. So I think this kind of idea of, spirituality and what you teach your children. So from an early age, we taught them about civil disobedience. I was a draft resistor at age 18 for Vietnam. I never filed for my draft card. I was prepared to go to jail as a protest to absorb resources from the war machine in a way. So that was early on. And so when we offered MDMA and psilocybin to our kids when they were 13, they'd already heard all sorts of stories about psychedelic psychotherapy, psychedelic mysticism. And it was just really, it was nice for them to feel comfortable to say, you're offering this, but we don't feel ready. It was really good.
Well, I think the important part is really the the transparency that you had and the 360-degree conversations that you're able to have with children. Other than, a lot of the kids, I think, feel that they're a little bit nervous about going to their parents about some of these these types of therapies. And when you're open about it, it really opens up the dialogue a little bit more, not just about that, but really with a lot of things that they're having trouble with in general. So I think that's really the importance of the mindfulness and the and really the just the interaction that you have with a lot of the kids as well. And you had mentioned something about research before, and Rick, you and I both have a lot of experience with drug development. We've both been through some of these FDA meetings, all the work, the strategy sessions, trying to bring multiple people together on the correct path to move forward, trying to get into the mind of the FDA. Whew, that's difficult stuff there. So given everything that happened last year, how are you doing? How are you processing everything?
Well, it's been among the most painful years of my life because several things happened.
Right.
One was that we had to move because of the rise of all the for-profit psychedelic companies. It became more difficult for us to raise donations. So we needed to move forward with investors. And even though they were impact investors investing in a public benefit corporation, what I found is that the incentive structure had changed. And what people were looking to do became more about financial returns than about public benefit. And as we hired more people from traditional pharma, they just did what they knew, which is they approached MDMA assisted therapy as if this was a traditional pharma situation. And they focused on wanting to be a drug company, not a drug plus therapy company. So it's been enormously painful for me to see that this pharma company that I helped create, that I thought would initially be 100% owned by a nonprofit and would be public benefit, then it wasn't 100% owned. In fact, the owner, about 40%. And that it became something where the people running it really didn't care about public benefit or articulating it or making that a big part of the culture. It became more about money. So I've been just in agony as I've been watching a series of decisions that I thought were not helpful. And as it turned out, they were not. So I've been trying to find a way to move the company back towards focusing more on public benefit. And I think that that's happening. And so that's been really reassuring.
There's something there, Rick, to sort of unpack, and it's something that I talk about where and again, look, everyone knows I've only been in the psychedelic space for 2 years, right? Psychedelics didn't come and change my life till about 2 years ago. So there's a lot of people like yourself who have been in this for a long time. And for me, I get the sense that psychedelics, right, are on this seesaw, that on one side, we have that corporate money, patents, FDA, yeah, but that's what gets money into legislation, and that's what opens the doors to, politicians. And on the other end, of course, we have the grassroots, the culture where you come from, and you stand right in the middle of it. Like you stand dead center in the middle of it. It's not one way or another. How do we get more people? How do we get, obviously, the people on one side who are like, we're just seeing dollar signs, or we're seeing how we can monetize this, or we're seeing. And then obviously the person who's going to say, what are you talking about, that I have to go to a doctor to get a prescription to mushrooms when I can grow them in my, what are you talking about? That's easy. Like what can we do? What needs to be done so that there's more of us standing in the middle of that seesaw?
Well, I think it's difficult. And I'll explain why I think that MAPS and the Beckley Foundation with Amanda Fielding are the only organizations that have this dual track mission. One is science and drug development to try to make psychedelics with therapy into FDA-approved prescription treatments covered by insurance. The other is drug policy reform, meaning that the drug war has always been counterproductive. It's never really been about drug abuse. It's always been about persecuting minorities of different kinds or another, or financial incentives for the private prison industry or the police, or, drug seizures that go to the police, asset forfeiture. It's also been about felony disenfranchisement. That's what's going on in Florida, where you arrest all these people more likely to vote Democrat, African Americans using crack cocaine and cocaine, and then you take away the right to vote. So the drug policy reform is the response to your question, how do you want to, charge all this money for mushrooms because I could just grow them myself? So people should be able to just grow it themselves. And what I think we need to do is to recognize, and it's been a difficult story to tell, how is it that I think that on the one hand, these drugs should only be administered under direct supervision of highly trained therapists with this whole situation through the FDA covered by insurance. And at the same time, I'm saying it should be available to anybody to do on their own. So I think it's a fundamental human right to explore your consciousness.
Correct.
Freedom of thought. There was just a conference the other day at Harvard Law School. And so one of the arguments or discussions was about this idea of freedom of thought, cognitive liberty. How likely is that? Freedom of religion. There's a lot of psychedelic religions and psychedelic churches all over the place now these days as well. So I think that for many people, it seems contradictory, but for me, it's the same story, is that on the one hand, really, everybody should be able to free to experiment. And then if the problems are happening, they've chosen them. But to do that, really, we should have honest drug education instead of DARE. We should really have pure drugs instead of an underground market. We've had people die from ecstasy contaminated with fentanyl that I've heard stories. People have died from. So we should have pure drugs. We should have drug checking. We should have honest drug education. We should have treatment on demand. And we should have a lot of education in what I call peer support. The research for psychotherapy outcome research has demonstrated that the key factor is the therapeutic alliance between the patient and the therapist. It's not, is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it Freudian? Is it Jungian? Is it behaviorist? Whatever it happens to be. Those are important, but the key thing is the relationship, the sense of safety and support, which people can provide for each other to some extent, even though they're not necessarily trained psychotherapists. So I think we need all of these things put in place for people to have access on their own without any. And then what we need to do is switch to performance-based evaluations rather than states of consciousness. So what I mean by that is, let's say for driving, there can easily, I don't know how easy, but it should not be that hard with all of our technology to have something where you put a key in the car and then you have like 20 seconds of your reaction time or whatever, some kind of test to see, are you ready to drive this car or not? And if not, the key doesn't work, something like that, or the engine doesn't work. No. Then the other idea is that we need to think about drugs not as inherently good or bad in and of themselves, but about the relationship that we have with it. That's the real issue, is that it's, and the quintessential example from Pharma is thalidomide. So thalidomide is the drug that was approved in Europe in the 50s and 60s for morning sickness for pregnant women. And it just had enormously terrible birth defects that it would cause. Yeah. And so thalidomide was actually blocked from being used in the US. Frances Kelsey was the person from the FDA. She's the only one in the entire history of the FDA that ever won the Presidential Medal of Honor. And it's because she blocked thalidomide from coming into the US market and causing all sorts of birth defects. So thalidomide became sort of the quintessential bad drug. But thalidomide is now a medicine for certain kinds of cancers and leprosy. It's not the thing itself, it's the relationship. And that's the fundamental problem with our whole drug war, is we've got certain drugs are bad or good or legal or not legal, but we don't pay attention to really the relationship. And so I think this kind of broader mission of both drug policy reform and drug development are what makes MAPS and Beckley Foundation relatively unique. The pharma companies don't want to talk about drug policy reform. A lot of the drug policy reform organizations don't know anything about pharma drug development or working through the FDA. And so we try to balance them by saying they're equal priorities.
They should be equal priorities. I mean, the education around it is key, like you said. I think, and that really is what kind of relates back to, you look at what's happened with cannabis. So you have cannabis that's actually gone through the drug development process, but then you have, obviously all these different scenarios in different states where it's legal from a medical standpoint or, a recreational standpoint too. So it's you have to get everyone in line and moving in the same direction to actually value the different components of how these are utilized. And if you're not transparent about all the utility of it, I think that's where everything sort of, gets a little bit more convoluted, especially with, I'll include myself as part of the group that comes over from the pharma industry. We've grown up a certain way and we've been trained a certain way. And it's the same thing with Western medicine as well. The physicians have been trained a certain way. They start to learn about the pharmacology and treating symptoms versus actually getting to the root causes of diseases. And this is, it's a fundamental issue with how we treat people. We don't really treat people until they're sick. And that's the point at which we treat symptoms, not necessarily the root causes. So I totally agree that it's a scenario where it's hard to really understand where we go, as long as, we're going all in the right direction, and valuing the policy as well as the treatment components from a medical standpoint as well. And I think with FDA as well, you look at a lot of the different ways that they're kind of viewing this, and you have to think that this was kind of thrown into their lap, and it was sort of a Herculean, type of task that you guys had to really have a lot of that education around not only just the efficacy of MDMA, but also the therapy that goes along with it. So, I'm sure there's a lot to work on, coming out of that. But anyway.
Yeah. We had to do a lot of work educating the FDA. I mean, the FDA has never looked at any combination treatment between drug and therapy.
Right.
And so I think the field is basically getting the wrong message from the rejection that we had. The field is getting this message: the therapy is so complicating, FDA doesn't regulate therapy, therefore let's minimize or eliminate therapy. And we have the example of Spravato, which is
it just came out. Yeah.
And now it's hitting. Spravato is ketamine, nasal spray, but it's now $1 billion annual sales without any therapy. And yet it doesn't work as well without therapy. But that's best for J&J, because when you end up having a drug that the experiences are not that durable, they fade pretty quickly, you need multiple treatments of the ketamine. When you combine it with therapy, you end up having more durable results, deeper results, more integration work. It's not just physiological, it's also about the content. But then all this money that goes to the therapist doesn't go to the pharma company. And then when you start really getting more durable results and deeper results, you don't need as much ketamine. Right. So we have this example of Spravato as being, this is a big, great success in the world of pharma. And then we have the criticisms that we received, like, people don't understand our therapy, and the FDA doesn't really regulate therapy. So I think the wrong message is being gotten by people in the industry, that it's not about what's best for patients. It's about what's simplest to get through the FDA, and that's drug. Forget about therapy. But MAPS has been, and Lykos, while I still was in charge of it, was really about what's best for patients. That is the operating philosophy. And that's why we got such great results. And that's why we helped build this entire psychedelic ecosystem. And so, when you ask how am I feeling, a lot of how am I feeling is really about sort of the loss of this kind of focus on what's best for patients as the guiding light to what's best for the pharma company.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that has been a really huge, big loss. I love this drawing.
That's a MAPS drawing. Yeah, it's beautiful. Rick, and again, obviously incredible disappointment, right? This has been your life's work, right? This has been your life's work.
I saw it coming, unfortunately.
As again, we need to learn, right, from those obstacles. We need to learn as a leader, because that's what you are. You're a leader in the psychedelic space. Yeah. How do you move forward, and what has this taught you? What has this taught you about, one, where we are, how we move this forward, right? Because again, the potential to help people through psychedelic medicine is there. The evidence is there. It's like I tell people, this isn't the psychedelics of the 60s. This is the psychedelics of Johns Hopkins University. This is the psychedelics of NYU. This is the psychedelics of Emory University here in Atlanta. Whole university that's got a whole department dedicated to psychedelic studies. It's not a professor teaching Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and Albert Hoffman. I mean, there's a lot of institutions banking on helping people to this. So, as a leader, how do you move forward, right? How do you move forward? Because there is a lot of people who are looking at you and saying, okay, Rick, what do we do next?
Well, that's a really great question. And for me, one of the biggest lessons is that when you're doing something innovative and new that has never been done before, psychedelic assisted therapy through the FDA, you have to be constantly proactive and educating both the FDA, the regulators, the doctors, the therapists, and the general public. And that the mistake that Lykos made was that they said, traditional pharma companies have what they call a quiet period while they're waiting for their drug to be approved by the FDA, maybe a year and a half or whatever before. And that was what was really disastrous, because when you have a quiet period for a drug that nobody's ever heard of, that's just a drug, maybe that works. But when you have a quiet period for a drug that is, 22 million Americans have used ecstasy or MDMA, one of the most popular recreational drugs in the entire world. And there are people that are concerned that it not become a medicine, all different kinds. So when you have critics and an extremely popular drug, and you decide not to respond to the critics because you have a quote, a quiet period, you're losing control of the narrative. And that's really what happened. So that's one of the reasons, why I was so glad to do this podcast, because what we really need to do is go back and really educate people again and change the narrative from, oh, this was a terrible drug and the FDA was right to reject it, and there was terrible science, and all these people are hurt, and if there's anybody that's benefited, it's probably not true, and all these accusations. So this idea that this constant need to really lead and educate is something that I think is one of the main things I've learned. Is the other part is what I guess people have seen from me over the years, which is that when you have something that you're trying to do that you think is so important, you just keep trying, So FDA said no. It was lots of loss of value in the pharma company. It was really frustrating and disastrous because we had anticipated it. It slowed down our work around the world because many countries are wanting to follow the FDA, and without FDA approval, it was going to be really difficult to get permission. Like, we're going to go do training of therapists at the end of April in Ukraine in early May. But Ukraine has laws against working with drugs that are not approved as medicine somewhere else. You can't do research even with Schedule I drugs in Ukraine. So we have to change those laws. That would have been something easy, of course, if the FDA had said yes. So I've learned that you just keep trying. You just try to figure out what went wrong. What's the way to keep trying? Who do you need to convince now? What were the mistakes that you made? How do you recover? And then I think for me, the idea that is so important is to think about storytelling. There was Frank Lutz, was a Republican pollster and operative, and he wrote a book that was really good. It was interesting. The title of it was, "It's Not What You Say, It's What They Hear."
Yep.
And that was the title of his book. So how do we tell? So here, the three of us are talking, but what people really listen to is patient self-reports.
Right.
Testimonials.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're not going to hear,
Yeah.
I could go on and on about the data. So what we like to say is the FDA wants data, but people need stories.
Stories. That's exactly
and they
right.
need stories from the people that they will believe. So one of the polling that's done, we talked about marijuana a bit. So, there's been now, I think, 39 medical marijuana states. More than half the population lives in marijuana legalization states. And the polling and the work has gotten pretty sophisticated. And so one of the top reasons why people vote for marijuana legalization is because they know a medical marijuana patient.
Right. Yeah.
They don't know what to believe with all of the propaganda. All of, marijuana does not cause lung cancer, but a lot of people have been told that it is for decades and decades. But when they know somebody, or somebody that they trust, that they don't know, but they trust them and believe them, that's what changes people's minds. So I think that this being a leader has to recognize that in many cases, I'm not the most effective voice. The most effective voice is going to be a lot of the patients. And people that have done this in underground settings or whatever. That's what's going to really change the attitude, and that's what we need to do a lot more of. And I think the last and final thing is that we really need to think about, as a leader, acknowledging what you did that was wrong. And when you're doing something new that's never been done before, and you're testing things out, some of them are not going to work. So one of the things that I learned from my Ibogaine experience, now I've only had one Ibogaine experience. It was back in 1985, and it was one of the most important experiences of my life. But I learned about this idea of separating self-criticism from self-hatred. This idea that I was so punitive, it was so difficult. I saw this negative pattern in my life that just caused me to vomit for like 10, 12 hours in a row. It was really horrible. But it was this idea that you should be perfect. You're not. You made this mistake. You fucked up. You're a bad person. Or so I was able to separate the link between self-criticism and self-hatred, and turn my internal critic into an ally in a way, because it wasn't so. All this is just to say that I think this idea of demonstrating that you've learned from your mistakes and then try to do things differently. That's also a big part of the leader. And I would say among the biggest mistakes that I made, I would say was, this sounds like the classic kind of like, it's not a real mistake, it's like, but it was thinking that we had done stuff in a startup way with very limited money. I mean, you understand, billions of dollars, lots of money is spent to make, on average, drugs into a medicine. We did it with a very, very small amount of money, relatively. And it's because we did it in a startup mode. And so I think when it looked like we were going to succeed in getting the data, and we'd had in 2017 the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA, and then it was 2016, then 2017 the special protocol assessment process where we negotiated the designs of the phase 3 study. It really seemed like that was the track was going to go forward, and then we had to think about commercialization, and I didn't really know about commercialization. My dissertation, my training was how to go through the FDA, get approval, but marketing drugs, I didn't really know. So the mistake was to think, oh, these experts from traditional pharma, they know what they're doing. But again, they know what they're doing if you're doing something that's been done before. But when you do something new, they're the wrong people to do it.
And it's a totally different model as you're moving forward too, because you have to start to think about how insurance is going to reimburse it. And then you have to have the commercialization plan that's going to match that. So you have the pricing models that are all set, ready to go. And this is such, trailblazing territory that you have to take time to think about how that's actually going to manifest too. So another thing that you had mentioned about just resilience and the problem solving ability that you need to have to be in something that hasn't been done before. I think, when you have something like this that happens, when you get a rejection from FDA, which you shouldn't take it as a rejection, but you should look at it as another opportunity to improve upon what it is that you're actually looking at from a clinical efficacy model as well. And I think the people that are attracted to the psychedelic space in general, I think have the wherewithal that you're talking about, because they've gone through this themselves and they're okay with at these points of what you call failure, but they're really looking at what's a better path forward. So hopefully, when you go through, there's a lot of these other psychedelic companies that some of which are publicly traded that they've really borrowed, like you said, a lot of folks from the pharmaceutical industry. Perhaps this is a moment where you can kind of sort of smoke a lot of those folks out that want to go back to the old model, and they had enough of, this territory. So, this is where you look for these individuals that do have that fortitude, the strength. Maybe they do have some experience from the pharmaceutical model, but they're willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and understand the work that needs to be done, both on the treatment side and the policy side, going forward with something like this. And I know that you're looking for an executive director right now for MAPS. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about, maybe that profile of that individual that you want in that position.
Well, keep in mind now, MAPS is the nonprofit, Lycos is the for-profit, and the for-profit is also looking for a new CEO. Well, for MAPS, I'm now the president, 71 years old, and it's time to start thinking about, building new leadership. And what I'll be doing is actually working more on both legalization things, fundraising things, but also trying to globalize access around the world, more in global humanitarian projects. So the executive director is someone that at the sort of top level has sort of public education, policy and advocacy, and research. Those are our three main areas. And they would need to be knowledgeable more about public education and advocacy, political advocacy. They don't necessarily need to know as much about research, or that would be good. I'll still be working on the research aspects of what MAPS is doing. But they need to be bold, and they need to be courageous, and they need to stand up and say things that most of the public will think is too early or is, outdated, or, most of the public don't. So they really need, but I think one of the things that, for me, the most important is that we need to build our base. What I've realized is the Massachusetts initiative to legalize plant medicines also failed. It got 43% of the vote. We thought it would get a lot more. And so MAPS has, because of the amount of money that we've needed for drug development, which now is going to be raised through LICOs, we had to move toward the big donor, the large donor strategy. But now, because things are more like this Massachusetts initiative that failed, but others will be happening. So we need to build our base. We only have a couple, like 3,000-4,000 annual donors. And I think we need to get up to 10 or 20,000. So that's going to be something this new executive director, can they really understand, how do you build a social movement? How do you build a nonprofit? What do you give to people that makes them feel that this is a useful contribution for them to make? When I first started back in 1986 with MAPS, I had the seemingly logical idea, like, look at all these hundreds of thousands of people that are doing ecstasy. If they each just sent us $10, we'd have all the money we need. And it took me a while to realize, first off, these people never thought we'd succeed. Secondly, if they had an extra $10, they're going to buy another pill of ecstasy.
Exactly.
They're not going to send it to us.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So this large donor, body of, large number of small donors, which is what I thought our base would be. We haven't developed that. So that I see is the opportunity now in this midst of the psychedelic renaissance, with so many people aware of what's going on. Now is the time, really, to find someone that knows about building a social movement.
Yeah.
You said something there. I was going to say, Rick, you said something there, which was really profound, which is bold and courageous. Right? Bold and courageous, which is what we all need to do. And if there was something that was incredibly bold and courageous, was Psychedelic Science 2023. Talk about taking over the entire convention center in Denver, putting in 13,000 people that weren't there to get high. They were there to really be educated and have wisdom cultivated in them about psychedelics and where psychedelics is going. So we have Psychedelic Science 2025 coming up. I'm incredibly excited about that. What does the future hold? I mean, what is it, and the other thing for me, having been at some of these conferences in the last 2 years, I do get a sense sometimes that we're talking to the same people. And I always ask myself, how do we tap into the psychedelic curious, right? How do we educate them? How do we show them? How do we create PSAs that says, look, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm the butcher, I'm the guy at Starbucks. And yes, we use psychedelics. We use them as life performance enhancers, because they make us more authentic. They make us feel more creative. They make us feel more empathetic. How do we get to them? Because I know Psychedelic Science is going to be amazing, but are we going to have people there who are, okay, I'm really curious. I want some wisdom cultivated in me about what psychedelics can potentially do, because then that's where we find those donors. That's where we find that money that sort of, can help this movement moving forward.
Well, first off, Psychedelic Science 2023 was just absolutely astonishing. It was one of the best days of my life. We did have 12,400 people there, which really was shocking. And it was every possible thing that happened that could have gone one way or another, it broke in the right way. We just had this really beautiful, it felt like we were charmed somehow. And it just felt such a moment of enthusiasm, and people coming up from the underground, and people seeing how big the community was. Rick Perry was just there. It was a big supporter. So we demonstrated bipartisan support. It was just thrilling, absolutely thrilling. And it's a different mood now with Psychedelic Science 2025. We had the FDA rejection. We've lost control of the narrative. There's a lot more negativity. But at the same time, I think, the image for me has been the Phoenix, the myth of the Phoenix. So we're over the summer, we were at the stage of burnt to a crisp and just in ashes. And now it feels like we're coming back and to be able to tell our story again in a new way. And so I think that these bold and courageous kind of steps to put on this show that we didn't know how many people would show up. I think that there's just that sense of sometimes universe rewards boldness. You move forward and you do something, and then people see that and they can rally around. So I think that's for me this sense. But then this other concept is really this idea of again, what is the story? What is the narrative? What are we trying to say? How do we get people to really feel excited and that this might actually appeal to them? So the idea about psychedelic curious people, a lot of them are not going to spend the money and the travel to buy a ticket. So I took a class at Harvard School of Public Health, and it was the guy who helped introduce designated driver into American culture. And the class was in part about how he did that. And the way he did that, surprisingly, was through Hollywood, through getting stories in TV shows and movies about, oh, here's a group of people at a party. Oh, this guy says, I'm not drinking, I'm the designated driver. You don't realize you're being educated. It's just like, oh, that's part of the story. That's the normal thing. So I think one of the best ways for us to get to the psychedelic curious is to try to get storylines in TV shows and movies and public service announcements and things like that, because that's really how people take in information. Now, these days, speaking as an old guy, right, you put it in TikTok stories or Instagram stories or whatever, social media. So we need kind of shorter versions of stories in the ways that people consume information these days. But still, there's an awful lot of people that really respond to TV shows and movies. I think that's and then the other part is that people who are psychedelic curious, you got to go to where the suffering is. So if they're curious, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do anything. But if they're curious and suffering, if they're curious and depressed, curious and addicted, curious and traumatized, then you say, look, there is something here that might help you. Yeah. And for them to get that news that there's something that might help them to deal with this. So they're curious and suffering. Those are the kind of people we have to start with first. And that was the whole idea for me, was that we needed bipartisan support. How did we get bipartisan support? And when I thought about what drug and what clinical indication, that's how we ended up with MDMA for PTSD, because we would have sympathetic patients, meaning women who've been sexually abused, men who've been sexually abused as a child, veterans in particular is what's gotten us bipartisan support. So I think if people are just curious, there's so much information overload that we have. So it's only when they feel a need that people are going to expand beyond that curiosity. Yeah.
And speaking of bipartisan support, so now you had folks like former Governor Rick Perry come out in support of Ibogaine. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's talked about a lot of this now on a national stage. So you now have RFK Jr., who is potentially going to be leading a conversation about this on the national stage, as well as the director of HHS. What is it that you think could potentially come of this new kind of invigoration of folks that are coming into the political scene that are definitely in support of psychedelics?
Well, I think the concern I have is that if psychedelics get approved, that people don't think it's because now politicians, psychedelics, put their finger on the scale and it was made into a medicine, even though the underlying data is not good or the drugs are too dangerous. So the antidote for that, for me, is transparency. And this is one of the key ways, and this is stuff Pharma never does, but you will not see a pharma company that puts in the public domain on their website their communications to and from FDA. But you can do that. And the FDA doesn't really mind it even. But pharma companies don't do it. A lot of them, it's because they think they're going to help their competitors or whatever. But we don't think that psilocybin is our competitor, or methadone. I was just for a long walk with Matt Baggett this morning. He's from a founder of a company called Tactogen. Tactogen is looking for MDMA-like drugs that are different in one way or another. These are not our competitors. We're all trying to build the psychedelic ecosystem. The scale of the suffering is enormous. So transparency is part of that. that is something that will help people to see, here's our raw data, here's our communications with FDA. So I think there is a more openness now. I think that the rejection of our new drug application by the FDA was not based on the data. It was based on all sorts of fears and allegations and things that I think will be proven not to be the case. So there has to be a review of all of the Lykos data that's going to take a bunch of months, 4 or 5 months. And I think this review of the data needs to be made public, and that this would then be a way to demonstrate that even though now there are more sympathetic people in the administration, that we want to demonstrate that the data is going to be based, decisions are based on the data, and that the data is going to be available for people to see. And I think one of the big misunderstandings that the past leadership at Lykos has had was that if you respond to critics, you are ending up giving more attention to the critics.
Right.
And it's a complete misunderstanding of science. Science is criticism. Science is constantly people attacking each other's claims, and that's good. You want the critics. You need the critics, but you need to respond to the critics. You need to, again, we get back to this sort of proactive communication policy. So I think in view of the fact that there is a more sympathetic politicians involved in the new administration, sympathetic more to psychedelics, it places an even more important focus on Lykos being transparent, so that, and then being honest about all of our communications, what the flaws were, and then trying to help people see that if there is support for MDMA becoming a medicine without another phase 3 study, or even with another phase 3 study, that it's based on the data and not just on sympathetic politicians not caring about the data.
Right.
Yeah, and the data is incredibly important, right? The data, and it goes back to that educational part, right? And we talk, or at least I talk a lot about microdosing, and there's obviously a difference between the therapeutic MDMA session for someone who needs that trauma, but there's people who say, you know what, maybe through microdosing I might see a little bit more clear. There might be a little bit more clarity. Dr. James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber just today released an incredible, wonderful book about microdosing, not just for wellness, but for performance enhancing, right? For life enhancing. Where do you see microdosing in the future conversation? Again, as more and more people, I mean, I read the other day that searching for microdosing in Google it was like 100 times or 1,000 times what it was in the last 10 years, obviously. So where do you see microdosing being part of this conversation? Because it is a more of an entry point for people, less of, I'm going to go on a trip, or I'm going to have an experience that I'm not going to know what's going to happen. So microdosing is out there. Where do you see that?
Well, I think there's incredible potential for microdosing in so many different areas. And the book, Jim and Jordan's book that just came out, has a whole range of reports of all the different ways that microdosing can be used. So I think that the research that has tried to show that microdosing helps creativity has so far failed to distinguish from placebo. And there's some concerns. Is it because the measures aren't that sensitive, or the people that are volunteering are already fairly creative, so you don't see much of a difference? A lot of people feel they're more creative under the psychedelics with microdosing. So I think that there needs to be more research. My concern about using microdosing, let's say for depression or PTSD, is that that's just another form of controlling the symptoms. It's not necessarily about getting to the root cause. Right. So if somebody says, I want to deal with PTSD or depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder or addiction or whatever, I could see value in microdosing as a sort of entry point to ease off other medications, and then to do fuller doses. So that the goal of MDMA-assisted therapy, the goal of psilocybin-assisted therapy, is to have a few deep interventions preceded by preparation and followed by integration to get to the root causes, so people can change their baseline and they can address and resolve certain things. So I think that macrodosing is the way to do that. And so I think that microdosing, for me, I think one of the main uses of it will be for creativity, for problem solving, for energy. I think that there will be people that use microdosing for healing, and I think there are, substantial benefits that can come from that. but I'm in general nervous about people feeling like they need a drug every day for the rest of their life.
Right.
Even microdosing is not used that way. It's a certain number of days on, certain number of days off.
Correct.
People find all their different ways, but still, I think microdosing is one of the greatest ways that's been developed to reduce people's fears about psychedelics, and that you can approach them in these smaller doses, smaller ways. And I think that it's got a lot of future, and it will be. I mean, people can see it like a vitamin, or people can see it like now. Here's what we don't know, which is dementia and other diseases. Can microdosing by promoting certain kind of brain activity and the neuroplasticity happens more at the fuller doses, but it still can happen a little bit at the microdoses. Is there a way that microdosing can play a role in chronic disorders like dementia? We don't know. So I think there's going to be a lot of research into sort of cumulative effects of long-term microdosing on other kind of chronic diseases and disorders. And just today I was talking to someone who's interested in trying to do certain kind of psychedelics for business problem solving.
Yeah.
And so I think microdosing has been a major contribution. And people often think, okay, if psychedelics don't work, I just need to take a higher dose. What microdosing is saying is, if you've had some difficult psychedelic experiences, maybe you're doing too high of a dose. You don't need a higher dose. Maybe you should go to a lower dose, or even a microdose, where by definition you're not supposed to notice. It's supposed to have just these subtle effects. But I think
that's perceptual.
Yeah, and the other part, which is just to talk about the placebo effect, which is it's a real thing. Somehow our beliefs are able to influence our chemistry, our immune system. And so let's just say microdosing for the moment, I don't believe this, but just say microdosing is only the placebo effect. It could be a real good tool to help us understand how the placebo effect works, so that then we can do it on our own without thinking, oh, I need a placebo. Why don't I just think positive thoughts, or somehow that I think is going to be the big future of medicine. We talked about preventative medicine. That's not really what pharma looks for, but I think microdosing can be a major, major contribution to preventative medicine to help people work through stress things at a lower dose, so that then they don't build up into higher things. But how can we really learn to stimulate our own immune system and our own body reactions to certain things without having to sort of trick ourselves with a placebo? How do we do that intentionally? That's, I think, one of the big promises maybe that microdosing can help us solve.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, these are all the clinical scientist in me is now kind of getting all my juices flowing and thinking about a lot of different design on these. And there's a lot of these, like you guys had talked about before, there's a lot of these really, big ticket universities that are now getting grants for a lot of this type of research. And it makes everything really exciting for what's to come too. So we're getting towards the top of the hour here. So Rick, again, it's been great to have you here. If you could leave us with some sort of message that you've been thinking about, and maybe some sort of a kind of a very sort of 30,000 foot level, what would you want to articulate to our listeners?
Wow. Well, I want to go to a quote from Carl Jung, which, and then I'll kind of explain how it is that's relevant. So this is a quote from Jung that I use in a lot of my talks. And it goes like this. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil. This was 1959, a few years after he died. I mean, a few years before he died, after World War II, after he had seen that. And so I think that this, we're entering into what seems to me to be a pretty dark period right now. And I think that we talk a lot about psychotherapy with psychedelics where things come to the surface and then you can deal with them. And they have, as long as they're sort of suppressed or unconscious, they sort of have power over you. But when they become clearer and you experience them and feel them, then you can address them and then you can integrate them and deal with them. So I think we have now is this coming to the surface of this enormous egotistical selfishness, narcissism, vindictiveness. It's us against them. It's the opposite of the world of we're all in it together.
Right.
So at a time when we have global warmings, nuclear proliferation, just the way in which we just had it with the pandemics, that that we're in a global world, and we need to move, I think, more to thinking in a global way and thinking of ourselves as global citizens. And instead, what we're doing is retreating into our different narrow tribes. So I think the thing I would like to leave people with is that while it does seem like the limited thinking and vindictiveness and narcissism is more to the surface now, there's an opportunity there for more people to see it and to try to respond to it and try to respond in a deeper way. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity ahead, and we need to just really listen as best we can to those people that think differently than us. And we're just talking about what might be the theme for Psychedelic Science 2025. And so the theme is likely to be the bridge. Yeah. That we need to be the bridge between different worlds, between different cultures, between people that are scared about psychedelics or not. And it reminds me of something that Timothy said that I thought was really hilarious and very wise. He said, if you want to be a bridge, you have to get used to being stepped on. You're going to get it from both sides. Why are you speaking to them? Why are you speaking to them? So I think that we all need to think about this being the bridge to harmonize these divides. We're way too polarized, way too tribalized, and we're not seeing people for who they really are. And we need to really get over that. And I think the understandings and the lessons that we've learned from psychedelics can help us to do that.
Yeah, it's because it's love. I think it's love. We have to build these bridges with love, right? They can't be built with anger. They can't be built with hate. They can't be built with misunderstanding. They have to be built, like you said, Rick, by listening with an open heart, by listening with consciousness, by listening with empathy. And maybe we don't have to see the same way, but at least we can lead with love. And I think if we do that, we could definitely be a much better society. And I know that you lead with love. I've been, in the presence of your love. I've seen you on stage, with who you are. If we do more of that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Yeah, I think so too. And thank you for this opportunity to sort of share with larger groups of people, what we're thinking about and talking about.
That's great. Well, that's great. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Everyone, thanks for watching. There's lots more of these to come. We're going to be doing these every 2 weeks. Again, thank you very much to Rick Doblin for the time and his leadership and what he's doing and helping this world become a better place. We'll be tackling a lot of different topics coming up for dads, for health and wellness, for mindfulness practices, communication, career transitions. So don't forget to hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. You can find Cesar and my social channels on the show notes. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Love you, wealth.
Yeah, appreciate everyone for watching. Thank you, Rick, so much. Looking forward to seeing you, Rick, in Austin at South by Southwest. I know that's going to be beautiful. I want to thank our incredible partners, Wonder Bags, AWS Scales, Frequency Capsules, Entheo, and Solo Dome for making sure that we're taking care of it, making sure we bring you the show. To everyone, much, much love. Keep cultivating that wisdom. And yes, today is the best day of your life. Go out and manifest all of the love you wealth that you can.
Thanks, everyone.